This video, we're going to look at pages 3, 4, and 5 of test or exam review 2. So sorry that this is blurry once again, but let's take a look at this B here. We have the absolute value of 2x minus 6 over 2 is greater than or equal to 5. I hope that's what it says at least. All right. So the first thing we need to do is we need to let 2x minus 6 over 2 be greater than or equal to 5, and 2x minus 6 over 2 is going to be less than or equal to negative 5. All right, then we're going to go ahead and solve through this problem, so we end up with 2x. If I multiply both sides by 2, that cancels that 2 out. 2x minus 6 is greater than or equal to 10. Add the 6 over. 2x is greater than or equal to 16. So x is greater than or equal to 8. The next one here, if we multiply the 2, we end up with 2x minus 6 is less than or equal to negative 10. I do not need to flip the sign because I'm multiplying both sides by 2, and it's a positive 2. If I were multiplying both sides by negative 2, we would flip the sign. So we have this. We're going to go ahead and solve for x, so we end up with 2x is less than or equal to negative 4. So x is less than or equal to negative 2. If we go ahead and graph that, so we have negative 2 equal to, we're less than, and 8, we are greater than. So there's our graph, and the interval notation here would be negative infinity to negative 2, bracket, union, another bracket, 8 to infinity. And the reason we're using brackets once again is because we can be equal to, because in the original problem we had a greater than or equal to start with. So there is our interval notation. The final answers to all of these inequalities should be a graph and an interval notation. All right, the next page, this is page 5. We're going to start with 12b, and we need to perform the operation, which means we need to distribute that 8x to the 4th y squared through to the rest of the problem. Now, the nice thing about these problems is there's not a whole lot of work to do. You can usually just kind of look at them and calculate it out, and then if you need to combine like terms, then do that. So I'm going to distribute this first to the first term. We're going to combine the constants, the x's, and then the y's together. So 8 times 2 would be 16. X to the 4th times x squared is x to the 6th. Y squared times y cubed is y to the 5th. So then we've multiplied that first term. Now let's go ahead and distribute to the next term. 8 times negative 5 is negative 40. X to the 4th, x to the 1st is x to the 5th. And y squared times y is y to the 3rd. Then we go that first term, 8 to the 4th, y squared times 3, and we have 24. And since there's no variables, we just write the variables we have in that term in front. And there we go. This is distributed all the way through. Okay, so then that's the multiplication or the distributing. Now we're going to take a look at some of the factoring problems. That's the hardest part of this section, is the factoring. So we'll spend a little bit more time going over those. All right. So when we're factoring, the very first thing that we want to do is make sure that we are factoring first the greatest common factor. So if I take a look at this b first, we want to factor the greatest common factor. Start by the common constant that they have. So I have between 2, 12, and 16. The greatest factor I can pull out would be 2. Then we go to the variables. We end up with an x squared, and then another x squared. So there's an x squared on every term, so we can pull out x squared. All right, and then we have y cubed, y squared, y to the 1st. So I can pull out y. And then we'll write the remaining polynomial left over. So if I divide the first term by 2x squared y, we are left with y squared. If we divide 12x squared y squared by 2x squared y, we are left with plus 6y. And if we divide 16x squared y by 2x squared y, we have plus 8. All right, so first look for the greatest common factor, which we did. And then second, we look to see if any of the remaining factors can be factored farther. So this y squared plus 6y plus 8, we want to try and find the two things that multiply to get to 8 and add to get to 6. So that would be 2 and 4. So y plus 2, y plus 4. And then we officially have the two factors factored. The trinomial, factored. If you're still struggling with factoring, I would definitely recommend going back and watching the videos that came from the quiz. You can also look up on YouTube how to factor trinomials, and there's a lot of different methods. So you can look on YouTube and find a method that makes sense to you if what I'm teaching isn't making sense. You can go to the tutoring lab, or you can even check out Khan Academy. All right, so this next factoring problem, this 3ay plus 12ax plus or minus 2by minus 8bx, it has 4 terms. So when we have 2 terms, we're going to use the difference of the squares or the sum and difference of the cubes. If we have 3 terms, we're going to factor the basic trinomial. And if we have 4 terms, we have to factor by grouping. So in this case, we will factor by grouping. Alright, so we're going to group together the 3ay plus 12ax and the negative 2by minus the 8bx. So, doing that, we look for a common factor within each group. So we're going to factor out 3a from both factors. Doing that, we are left with a plus 4x. Now let's look at the second group. We have the negative 2by minus the 8bx. There's a common factor of negative 2 and also a b. So what we're left with is y plus 4x. Now we will factor out the common factor that is left between the two groups. So now the two groups you look for a common factor, and it will be a binomial. So we have y plus 4x times whatever's left after factoring the common factor out. So we have 3a minus 2b. And we have factored the entire polynomial by grouping. Alright, this next problem, factor completely or state if the polynomial is prime. So we will not have any primes on the test, so make sure that you are factoring. We have x squared minus 10x plus 24. So since there are 3 terms, we want to look for 2 things that multiply to get to positive 24. That means the 2 things must be the same sign, and add to get to negative 10. So they're the same sign, and the sign is whatever this 10 is. So a lot of people would think, well, 12 and 2, 12 minus 2 is 10, but that won't work because they must be the same sign. So the 2 factors would have to be negative 6 and negative 4. So that means that when we go to factor this, we should get x minus 6 times x minus 4. And that is it. Alright, the last problem here is the same thing. We need to factor completely or state that the polynomial is prime. Remember that when we are factoring, the very first step in every single factor problem, as soon as you start a factor problem, you must ask yourself, can I factor out a greatest common factor? That is very important. So on this next problem here, we want to say, can we factor out a greatest common factor? And the answer is yes. They all have a common factor of 2. Before you take that 2 and multiply the last term, you must factor out the greatest common factor. So I factor out a 2 from every term. X squared plus 5x minus 6. Now we want to find 2 factors that multiply to get to negative 6 and add to get to positive 5. So since it's a negative 6, they must be opposite signs. That means that 3 and 2 will not work because they have to be opposite signs. And they need to add to get to positive 5. So positive 6 and negative 1 are the 2 factors that will work here. So we end up with x plus 6, x minus 1. But do not forget the greatest common factor that you multiplied or that you pulled out very, very first. So there is our factoring.